Okay, so we had started talking about the maxillary artery, and so far we spoke about its branches in the mandibular part, or the first part. In this video, we are going to discuss about its branches in the pterygoid and the pterygopalatine part. So first of all, we saw that maxillary artery is one of the two terminal branches of the external carotid artery with a wide area of distribution. In its course, it was intimately related to three structures: the mandible, lateral pterygoid muscle, and the pterygopalatine fossa. And the lateral pterygoid was used as a point of reference to divide its course into three parts, which is the part before it, or the mandibular part, the part on it, which is the lateral pterygoid part, and the part after it, which is the pterygopalatine part. In the first part, we saw that as it arises behind the neck of the mandible, it gives 5 branches, which were the middle meningeal, accessory meningeal, anterior tympanic, deep auricular, and the inferior alveolar. And we discussed about all of these arteries in detail. Now in the second part, we'll be seeing about its arteries in the pterygoid part and the pterygopalatine part. So as it emerges behind the neck of the mandible, the maxillary artery from the lower border of the lateral pterygoid runs upwards and forwards, either superficial or deep, to the lower head of the lateral pterygoid. Here it gives 4 branches. Okay, so in this part it gives 4 branches which supply the muscles of the mastication. These are the masseteric artery, deep temporal arteries, pterygoid branches, and the buccal artery. I've written a mnemonic to remember this, which is below the man down. B for buccal, T for pterygoid, M for masseteric, and D for deep temporal. So all of these arteries supply soft tissues of the muscles of mastication, and these are the ones that do not pass through any foramen or any fissure. Okay, so let's briefly discuss about all of these arteries. The first one is the masseteric artery, and then we'll talk about the pterygoid artery. So the masseteric artery accompanies the lingual nerve. It is small and passes laterally through the mandibular notch to the deep surface of the masseter, which it supplies. Pterygoid artery varies in number according to authors. However, it supplies the lateral pterygoid muscle and the medial pterygoid muscle. So the masseteric artery supplies the deep surface of the masseter muscle, and the pterygoid artery supplies the medial and the lateral pterygoid. The next is the deep temporal artery. Let's see it in this diagram. These are the deep temporal arteries. Okay, so the deep temporal artery, this branch bifurcates into 2, the anterior and the posterior branches, and they course between the temporalis and the pericranium respectively, supplying the muscles, and anastomose with the middle temporal artery. The anterior division communicates with the lacrimal artery by means of small branches which perforate the zygomatic bone and the great wing of sphenoid. The final one is the buccal artery. Let's see it in this diagram. This is the buccal artery to the buccinator. So the buccal artery runs obliquely forward between the pterygoidus internus and the insertion of the temporalis muscle to the outer surface of the buccinator muscle to which it supplies. It anastomoses with the branches of the facial artery and the infraorbital artery. From the infraorbital area, the buccal artery descends bilaterally in the superficial region along the lower lateral margin of the nose, then running anti-parallel to the facial artery, crosses the lateral oval region. So it runs downward, forward obliquely, supplies the buccinator muscle, and anastomoses with the facial and the infraorbital artery. So with this, we complete the arteries from the pterygoid region. Let's quickly move on to the arteries in the pterygopalatine region. Okay, so the maxillary artery further from here, it passes between the 2 heads of the lateral pterygoid, and through the pterygomaxillary fissure enters the pterygopalatine fossa, where it lies in front of the pterygopalatine ganglion. So let's see this. So the maxillary artery enters the pterygopalatine fossa through the pterygomaxillary fissure. Okay, and here it lies in front of the pterygopalatine ganglion. So in this course, it gives about 6 branches. Okay, but before entering the pterygopalatine fossa, it gives 2 branches. So out of the 6 branches, 2 are given before entering the fossa, which is the infraorbital artery and the posterior superior alveolar artery. Let's see it in this diagram as well. So the branches are infraorbital, posterior superior alveolar, greater palatine, pharyngeal, sphenopalatine, and the artery of pterygoid canal. This can be remembered by the mnemonic PIC-PASS. So here is the third part. It's giving infraorbital and posterior superior alveolar before entering the pterygopalatine fossa, and the rest for after entering it. Let's start by talking about the infraorbital. So the infraorbital artery arises just before the maxillary artery enters the pterygomaxillary fissure. It enters the orbit through the inferior orbital fissure and then runs forwards in relation to the floor of the orbit, first in the infraorbital groove and then in the infraorbital canal, to emerge on the face through the infraorbital foramen. So it emerges from the inferior orbital fissure, runs along the infraorbital groove and canal, and emerges on the face through the infraorbital foramen. It gives off some orbital branches for structures in the orbit, middle superior alveolar branches for the premolar teeth, and anterior superior alveolar branches that enter apertures in the maxilla to reach the incisor and canine region attached to the bone. So it gives some branches towards the orbit, some for the premolars and some for the incisors and the canine. After emerging on the face, the infraorbital artery gives branches to the lacrimal sac, nose, and the upper lip. Okay. The remaining branches of its third part arise within the pterygopalatine fossa. The next artery is the posterior superior alveolar artery. So the posterior superior alveolar artery also arises just before the maxillary artery enters the pterygomaxillary fissure. It descends on the posterior surface of the maxilla. Okay, this is the maxilla. It descends on the posterior surface of the maxilla and gives branches that enter canals in the bone to supply the molar and the premolar teeth and the maxillary air sinus. So in the first video, we had seen that the mandible and each tooth of the mandible is supplied by the inferior alveolar artery. So in this part, we have seen that the maxillary teeth are getting supplied by the posterior superior alveolar artery and some branches from the infraorbital artery. Now that we have studied the 2 branches that have been given before entering the pterygomaxillary fissure and then further the pterygopalatine fossa, let's study the branches within the pterygopalatine fossa. So here we have another 4 branches, which are the sphenopalatine, descending palatine, artery of pterygoid canal, and the pharyngeal artery. Okay, so the artery of the pterygoid canal, let's begin with this one. Can you spot it in this diagram? It's this artery. Okay, so you can see that it passes backwards along the pterygoid canal with the corresponding nerve and supplies the upper part of the pharynx and sends a small division into the tympanic cavity to anastomose with the tympanic arteries. Okay, so it passes backwards and supplies the upper part of pharynx and sends a small division into the tympanic cavity to anastomose with the tympanic arteries. Next artery we're going to talk about is the sphenopalatine artery. So we have covered infraorbital, posterior superior alveolar, artery of pterygoid canal. Now we come to the ones in the nasal cavity, the sphenopalatine artery. So the sphenopalatine artery supplies the nasal cavity and it is also called the nasopalatine artery. It passes through the sphenopalatine foramen into the cavity of the nose at the back part of the superior meatus. Here it gives off its posterior lateral nasal branches, and crossing the inferior surface of the sphenoid, the sphenopalatine artery ends on the nasal septum as the posterior septal branches. Here it will anastomose with the branches of the greater palatine. So in the nasal septum, the sphenopalatine artery ends with the posterior septal branches. These branches anastomose with the branches of the greater palatine artery. Okay? And the sphenopalatine is also often referred to as the artery of epistaxis. Okay, so this is the area with so many blood vessels anastomosing, right? So the sphenopalatine artery is the artery responsible for the most serious posterior nosebleeds and can be ligated surgically to control such nosebleeds.